Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. And the Nation Talks has been around for quite some time. In fact, this is our 189th show. And during that time, we've interviewed philosophers, authors, writers, journalists, politicians. It goes on and on and on. It's the place where you come to if you want to hear in-depth discussions on subjects that you find interesting, but not covered in the mainstream media to any significant degree. So you're starved in the mainstream media, but we feed you very well on this show, as you know. And our whole object is to inform, educate, and entertain. And we're going to do that tonight, I guarantee you. But first of all, let me speak a little bit about the fact that this has been a great day for British democracy. Let me start off with a number. See if you can fit this number in your head. The number is $64.8 trillion. Not $1 million, not $1 billion, but almost $65 trillion, right? That's enough to carpet the whole of London in £50 notes 4 times over. Where did that come from? What huge amount of money came from what sort of source? Where did it appear from? Well, it's very straightforward. It came from the rape of India. That's it. The British government and the British East India Company, because it all started with a corporation, which was able to form its own armies. In fact, at one time, you're never going to believe this, but the British East India Company had more troops than the British Army. Of course, inevitably, because of the nature of its business, which was opium and other interesting products, it went bust. That's the nature of these enterprises. And then the British government came in and rescued it. But keep thinking about that $65 trillion. That was the amount, according to Oxfam, that the British government extracted from India between 1765 and 1900. And they were talking about this at the World Economic Forum. So where did it all go? Well, the poor, I can guarantee you, in Britain saw very, very little of that $65 trillion. But many other people saw a great deal of it. Right? Now, some of you may be thinking, yeah, but the Scots played full part in that. I wouldn't dispute that. I would simply say, was it ethical? Was it moral? And was it a great day for British democracy that happened? Let me add one other thing. BRICS. BRICS. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They've added a few since then, including the United Arab Emirates. But essentially what that means, this is a growing arrangement of countries who may at some stage in the very near future form their own currency. So it's probably not a smart idea to take these people on head first, but I guess that's what Donald Trump plans to do in part. But India isn't India that the British raped. It's a very different country indeed. And the over 1 billion people there might not have a very welcoming attitude towards a sort of approach that they think the West has traditionally taken towards their countries. So we could be in for a bit of a different environment, because after all, BRICS mentality is to say we want to present an alternative to the Western viewpoint at a very time where the United States wants to, in fact, enhance the Western viewpoint. These two objects are irreconcilable. But let's see where it all ends up. It's going to be a rough ride, I can guarantee you. Anyway, enough of all that. Right? It's my great pleasure to welcome someone who you will see from the very beginning is somebody who we should have interviewed some time ago. Her name is Laura Webster. She's the editor of The National. She is the very epitome of the sort of person you would like to see representing Scotland. So without any further ado, welcome Laura Webster.
Hello, thank you. That was so kind. Thank you for the very nice things you said. And also congratulations, 189 shows is crazy. So
Thank you.
Done.
You're very kind. How are you, Laura?
I'm good. I'm sort of run ragged as usual, dealing with the daily paper and also the Sunday National, which I've been editing since kind of last summer as well. So it's a very busy time to be a journalist, but I'm getting through it and surviving.
So do you have any free time at all?
Yeah, I managed to sort of still have a social life and whatnot. And I think probably my friends and family go crazy with me, like sitting on my phone late at night, looking for see what the production team have done for their front page and checking it out and stuff. Saturday night, sort of checking that the Sunday looks all good. But they can deal with it. That's just how it goes when you're in my industry.
Now, if you don't mind me saying so, and certainly others have said this also, you seem very young to be editing 2 newspapers.
Yes, as far as I know, I'm still the youngest national newspaper editor in the UK. So that's what I've got going for me at the moment. Though I am aware that, at any opportunity, some younger person could come along and take another one off, and I'll lose my USP, as it were. But since the end of 2023, that's when I took over. Or 2022. I lose track these days. It was just before Nicola Sturgeon resigned anyway. So end of 2022, that's when I took over as editor. It's a great opportunity to be my age and doing this and giving younger people a voice in the Scottish media, certainly, I think, is a real privilege.
I think a lot of people, young people, particularly young women, will probably be looking at you and saying, "Oh, I'd love to be there. I'd love to do that." What do you say?
I get that sometimes by email and stuff, because we get a lot of young journalism students wanting to come and do work experience with us. So it's obviously lovely to get that kind of feedback and to show young women that there's a path into kind of senior levels of journalism as well. So we do what we can at the National to bring in work experience folks. I think we have 3 people in on work experience this week. So we do it most weeks. We'll have somebody in the office kind of learning the ropes and seeing how it all gets done.
That's very creditable. I want to talk about journalism in the round and then perhaps focus on 1 or 2 issues that may be particularly topical. I'm going to ask you the question that I asked last week, the week before rather, about the different nature of things. A lot of people looking at newspapers nowadays, particularly British newspapers, might wonder if there's ethics in journalism. How would you respond to that?
They might wonder what, sorry?
If there's ethics in journalism anymore.
Oh, ethics in journalism. Well, I think that there's ethics in good journalism, certainly. I think the UK has a bit of an epidemic of bad journalism, has done for a long time. I think you can see this most clearly in kind of some of the broadcast channels which have become popular in the last couple of years. There's a lot of, but this is not a new thing. It goes back some way. And before we went live, we were talking about the Prince Harry story and the fact that the Sun newspapers have had to give an apology to him. So there's a long history in the UK of both tabloid and broadcast media being exploitative, taking advantage of vulnerable people. And so there's a real need for ethical journalists to step into the light, because it helps to increase trust in our industry and show people that we really cared about what we're doing and we really cared about, not making situations worse for the people that we're doing stories about. We have a responsibility and a duty of care, which sometimes doesn't get respected by journalists. And it is unfortunate that it is often the ones who are most well known who get into the most trouble.
I remember a story which Andrew Marr told me. I think it was in the Public Prince too, so I'm not telling tales out of school. One of his first jobs in journalism, I think, was the northeast of England. And his job, in part, was if there was a fatality, he went and knocked on the door of the bereaved and tried to steal photographs from the mantelpiece in order to use in the next edition of the newspaper. And he moved on to be editor of The Guardian, of course, to appear on the BBC and elsewhere. think that's where maybe people form a view of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable.
Certainly.
It's worrisome, really.
It is. It's really concerning. And obviously, we have the Editor's Code of Conduct from IPSO, who is the press regulator. I would say that most of the principles within that code, you can kind of, if you wanted to do something maliciously, you could probably make it work for you and you wouldn't really get into that much trouble. You can kind of bend the definitions maybe of what people could argue was accurate or fair. And then the kind of consequences from something like IPSO are not particularly strong, right? So you might have to issue an apology or you might have to put a correction in the newspaper. But would that really deter a journalist who is behaving unethically from doing that again? I don't think so. If that was the case, then we wouldn't be seeing newspapers still kind of do what you referred to there, the modern version of going into somebody's house and taking a picture of a bereaved, scouring through people's social media feeds to get pictures of people who've died and whatnot. That happens all the time. So I think that there is a need maybe for another look at how we regulate the industry. And also maybe just, I think journalists just have to take more responsibility themselves and understand the kind of platform that they're on. You write for maybe hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And so you have to take that seriously and make sure you're using your platform responsibly.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it is, I think a lot of people don't understand how journalism works. In other words, they read the newspapers and they watch the online versions, but I suspect they don't really know. I mean, because every journalist has an editor, you're an editor, and you would expect the people who report to you to do what you ask them to do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what the confusion in the public mind, at least in part, is that journalists often present themselves as independent agents. I'm objective, I'm impartial, etc., etc. The reality is that they can only write what the editor asks them to write. They can't just go off and say, I'm going to be impartial about moon landings. They have to stick to the knitting, as it were. And I'm not sure everyone understands that. And every editor in turn has a boss. And so therefore there's a clear reporting line. But that's not necessarily visible to the person who's actually reading the piece, as it were.
Definitely. I think there's an important need to be more transparent with people about how journalism works. So one of the things that we did, I think about 2 years ago now, was we started a newsletter weekly called Behind the Headlines. And the idea of that is that we give people insight into how we made decisions in the newsroom that week, or how, we went and handled a press conference, or what it was like when we went to some political event, or maybe an ethical dilemma that came up. There's all different kinds of things that we use it for. And I think that people have really responded positively to that because they like to know these things. And there's no need for us as journalists to keep that secret and hidden. And I think that only goes further to making people distrust the press when they feel like they don't know what we're doing, as you describe. And so I've tried in my time as editor to be more transparent with people, to be super kind of active on social media and to reply to people who have questions about things. And even if those people maybe aren't very fond of the newspaper, or if they might not agree with me, I want to engage with them still. And because that's my responsibility. We're putting work out there into the world for people to read and people to be informed by, and they have every right to have their say. So people ask me all the time, why, God, like, how do you handle getting so many like horrible messages and all these abusive things on social media? And I just say, well, do you know what? I don't like it. It's not very nice, but it is those people's right to have their say. And just in turn, there's just as many lovely people who email me and reply to me and say, oh, we loved what you did with the National this week, or I really loved this article. Can I get a copy of it sent out to me? All of that. And it's all just part of, I think, how the public engages with the paper. And it would be worse if no one said anything at all. So, yeah.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, here's a typical one, a comment from one of our audience tonight, Geronimo, who's saying, Laura, I think you're great. I love reading lots of letters and articles in the National. The National is a godsend.
Oh, thank you. That's lovely. That's nice.
Here's a question as well, which, I mean, if you feel this is not something you particularly want to talk about. But Charles Smith is asking, as we head into the Trump era, have you any sort of A1 algorithm for sifting out misinformation?
Gosh, that's a really interesting question. I mean, part of the journalistic process is sifting out disinformation, right? Because we're always looking to verify what we've been told, and we need, two sources to confirm something at least. And sometimes it's different, sometimes you need more. So part of what we do every day is sifting through disinformation. And in a way, the Trump era makes it much harder because there's a lot more disinformation being thrown at you. I don't think that there's any way around that, because I can't personally remove Donald Trump from the presidency of the United States. I just have to accept that he's in that job, and we need to sort of respond to the kind of stuff that he puts out there in a way that is responsible and in a way that informs people about the truth of what's really happening. So it's really just a case of doing our jobs well, I think, is how we handle that. Although I think the thing that concerns me most is sort of generative AI, the ability for people to create images and videos. And I've seen some that look very convincing, and they're very hard to verify. Particularly ones that are very good at imitating a person's voice. That's really frightening, because gosh, like, how could you really make sure that that's real? But there are tools that you can use to check if you think that something is AI, and there's kind of giveaways. But yeah, we would never just see an image and then report on that image without doing the necessary journalistic checks in the background. So it's a scary time, but if you have good journalists doing their jobs effectively, then hopefully we can try and go some way to kind of dispelling the lies that fly around.
Yeah, I mean, it's disconcerting. I mean, looking back to the 30s, one of the techniques that was used in Germany was misinformation on an enormous scale.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, any contrary source was removed, and there was only one point of view, and that point of view was hammered hour by hour, minute by minute, and it produces an effect on the people who are consuming it. They become uncritical to a very large degree, and you can almost see some of that happening in the United States just now.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I've got lots of friends who've been in touch and said, "Oh, gracious, what must you think of us?" And that's not the way I view it at all. It's more how does that happen? And it's not accidental, and B, is there any end to it? That's the other issue, which is going to be very difficult to handle. Sorry, I interrupted you there.
No, that's okay. And I was just making the point about AI, really, and I think the another fear that I have at the moment is with how things are going with the ownership of social media platforms. I know for a long time we've talked about actual physical media ownership in the UK. A lot of the newspapers are owned by Rupert Murdoch, for instance, and a lot of the platforms are owned by the same people. GB News, like, who even knows what's going on there with the ownership structure? But I think having people like Elon Musk potentially interested in even buying a platform like TikTok should really be quite scary as well. I've seen a lot of people talking about how TikTok has maybe changed since it came back online in the US. Obviously, it went offline very briefly as a result of a Biden policy, and then came back online, and something that Trump is boasting about. And he's talked quite a bit about it in the past couple of days as well. I actually, this is bad journalism, because I haven't had time to verify and check it for myself, but I had seen reports that the phrase "Free Palestine" was now banned on the app in America. So there's an example of how very ideological people getting into power and controlling the social media that we've come to associate with freedom of speech is actually very dangerous. And I think there's a real risk of people like Elon Musk or other kind of associated tech bros coming along and controlling what is and isn't okay to say at the whim of somebody like Donald Trump. Which is really worrying, because a lot of activism happens on those kinds of platforms. I think us as Scottish independence supporters, campaigners, should be very wary of that. And it's an important reminder that we should be making sure to do our activism in real life as well as just on social media.
Well, people will be able to see on the bottom of my title, it says you can find me at Blue Sky. That's because I took the advice of Kevin, our producer, and I said, look, let's move across. He said, move to Blue Sky. To which my response was, what is Blue Sky? But but now I've got a whole bunch of followers on Blue Sky, and I would encourage everyone in the audience tonight to go and follow me there rather than follow me on Twitter, because it seems to me that you've got a platform there which is a good deal less polluted than Twitter is becoming increasingly. And I think that's important. The other thought I would give to people is that you've still got a chance to support Independence Live on the crowdfunder. It's only $2.99 a month, and it's great value. It's almost as good value as the National, I have to say. So
you get both. Support both of us.
Precisely. Yeah, we should cross market. But when you look at the Scottish political scene just now, you're aware that there's a whole bunch of people who support independence who are not particularly happy with the pace shown by the Scottish government. They think it's pedantic. Some people have said to us that the First Minister looks like someone who sees constitutional politics through the wrong end of a municipal drain pipe. And in other words, he's very good at meat and potato stuff, but not quite so exciting when it comes to dealing with broad constitutional matters. And people point to the fact that he turned up for a meeting chaired by the Prime Minister, but which included people from local authorities in England, and there were no local authorities from Scotland represented, and they thought that was demeaning to a degree. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that view that some people have?
I think it's really interesting. So being in the position that I'm in, I hear a lot of different arguments about the way that independence should be pursued, right? And one of the ones that kind of stands out to me is the idea that we shouldn't be putting so much expectation on elected politicians to really like show us where to go in the independence movement. And I think that's very reasonable because the government in Scotland, obviously, its focus should primarily be on governing, because when it governs poorly, it polls poorly, that maybe damages support for independence. Like I see that argument as well. And it's something that a lot of the readers have said to me, is that they didn't like that the government was doing these independence white papers. They would have rather seen that in the party's hands, because it maybe would have given it a bit more flexibility, a bit more radicalism, because by its very nature, the government's going to be a bit more cautious, and it's not going to throw crazy innovative ideas out there necessarily, because they're focused on actually how to run the country. So I think the problem really lies with the fact that where is the leadership in the independence movement right now? There's certainly a bit of a vacuum, and a lot of people who want to fill that vacuum. But I'm not sure that there's one clear person who can unite everybody and really fulfill that role. I think it's quite clear that John Swinney maybe doesn't really want to be that person. As you said, he's more about the meat and potatoes and kind of focusing on the day-to-day job, which for a long time SNP spinners, government spinners have said to me that their ideal kind of process towards independence is by governing well, they'll show the people of Scotland that independence is the next step. So it really seems to me that there's a lack of a unifying figure who could really take the independence movement forward right now, and we'll just have to hope that somebody comes along to really take on that role, because none of us want to see the kind of factionalism that's in the movement right now.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, our personal experience was I invited the Constitution Minister, so-called, to come on the show and talk about constitutions, and he said it's not something I particularly want to do. And I thought, how very odd. And obviously, the SNP view of the Constitution is written with a very small c. In other words, it's working within what presently exists rather than seeking to change the relationship. And I think a lot of people want to see a changed relationship. They point out to the fact that if England wanted to leave, for example, the Union, it would simply do so. It wouldn't seek any sort of permission from anyone else or supplicate themselves in any way, shape or form. They would just simply leave. And they say, well, maybe somebody should be driving this with some enthusiasm. In other words, you don't have to be content living inside the cage. You should be rattling the cage. And the cage is always going to be intact if you don't rattle it.
Certainly.
I'm mixing my metaphors here now. I hope you'll forgive me. But essentially, that's the sense that people have, is if you're going to be dynamic and progressive, I'm afraid you're going to have to make some noise. And I think
certainly.
people want noise just now.
It's not governments who make noise, really, and we can't put our expectations on politicians who are worried about their next election and keeping their jobs to be the people to really make a song and dance about things. And it is interesting that you mentioned that about the Constitution Minister. I've had similar experiences, and I do note that it looks like the Scottish government, the SNP, are going to potentially make a deal with the Lib Dems in order to pass the budget. And that would almost certainly involve not having any spending put aside for Scottish independence, because that was the Lib Dems' key demand. So if they're willing to do that, then that should show that's where their head's at right now. Independence is not on the kind of immediate agenda as far as the Scottish government views it. And if anything, that should just put a spark under everyone in the movement's bums, because like, if they're not going to do it, someone else needs to do it. And someone else needs to create the kind of political space where we're going to be able to have a campaign succeed.
Yeah, I think so. I think what they would expect, though, in the light of that, that's a good analysis, if you don't mind me saying so, is that if the Scottish government goes down that route, at least stay neutral and not get in the way. And I think what I described earlier when John Swinney sat down with English local authorities, that's getting in the way, because that is accepting the status quo in its entirety. And I think people find that disabling, because they would like to see a very different approach, perhaps, or an attitude. And if you're not prepared to talk about the Constitution, it's very difficult to see how people can feel you're enthusiastic about changing it. And it also seems that there's a tremendous degree of comfort with the status quo. And making little bits of tweaks and modifications around the status quo, but not in any way, shape, or form seeking to disturb that. And when you talked about the connection with the Lib Dems, I'm reminded of, because I'm reading Rory Stewart's book on his time, Rory the Tory, working in the government. And it's a salutary lesson. It really is. It should be required reading if you think there's anything solid and profound about the way that the British government works. And he had a situation where the Lib Dems and David Cameron were working together as a combined government, as a coalition government, and they demanded abolition of the House of Lords. And he said to David Cameron, no way. And so that whole, but the Lib Dems continued to be part of it.
Yeah.
Once we've signed up, we've got our ministerial mondeo. Hey, way to go.
Just speaking of coalitions, I did note that today John Swinney laughed at the idea of a SNP Labour coalition after the next election, but he didn't rule it out altogether.
Well, he shouldn't, because it may seem unlikely just now, but there was a time in Labour politics, certainly at the beginning, I'm thinking about Keir Hardie, etc., where there was a tremendous degree of sympathy for home rule. I mean, it was part and parcel, along with the abolition of the House of Lords. That was always going to be a central part of what Labour were about. But these things got jettisoned, and I understand why. You can't be sitting at Westminster talking about home rule for Scotland, particularly when they had the Irish situation bubbling along at the same time, and they hadn't a clue what to do about that. But it does strike me that, even though it sounds unlikely now, who's to know what sort of coalition might emerge in the future, particularly if a split develops in the Labour Party in Scotland, as seems perhaps likely now. We've even had people like Neil Findlay, who, if he's watching tonight, we'd love to have him on the show, and he said there's no future for Labour after WASPI.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really fascinated by Labour politics, and I've had friends who are members of the Labour Party have left, aren't happy with Keir Starmer. As much as I would love to see people in the Labour Party really stand up to Keir Starmer and stand up for what they believe in. You've got these people like Brian Leishman, really outspoken about Grangemouth and the Labour Party's position on austerity. My feeling is that we've been down this road before, and that the Labour Party ultimately is this huge institution, and people are so tied to the idea of being a Labour member. I mean, you mentioned somebody like Neil Findlay. As far as I know, he's still a Labour member, despite everything. So the idea of a split really emerging and being a serious kind of threat to the current Labour Party, I think at the moment is quite unlikely, unfortunately. Of course, they did the Scottish Labour Party back in the 70s. Neil Ashton and Jim Sillars launched that, and that did sort of end in very dramatic scenes from what I've heard.
But if there is a big difference between Labour and Tory, and increasingly there isn't, but there is a difference, is the Tories always hang together. They've always taken the philosophy, it seems to me anyway, if we don't hang together, we'll surely hang separately. Whereas Labour have taken a different view, which is that it's all about factions. And the factions subsume their differences in order to win elections. But then as soon as the election is won, even without any external stimulus, because it's an unlikely alliance of people from the left and the not so far left, etc., it seems to me as Starmer continues his rightward drift, because he's hugely concerned about losing votes to reform, etc., that will increase the tensions within an already very tense environment. In other words, the Labour Party is sort of fractured, but there's a patina that makes it look united.
Certainly.
So if any party was likely to split, it would probably be Labour.
I think so too. But I mean, if you look at what happened with Jeremy Corbyn, there was a lot of unhappiness with Jeremy Corbyn within the Parliamentary Labour Party, and that resulted in, 9 of the MPs left, and they formed the Independent Group for Change. That was so short-lived. I think many of the viewers tonight would probably be like, what the hell was the Independent Group for Change? Like, that didn't have any impact whatsoever. And a bunch of them just rejoined Labour, I think. So even when there was such turmoil under Labour, which I'm not saying was a reasonable reaction to Jeremy Corbyn's leadership in 2015, but there was certainly a lot of people who were very unhappy with it within the Westminster kind of part of the party. If that wasn't going to be the thing that produced a proper permanent split in Labour, I'm just not sure that it would happen when they're in power and they've got that support and they're able to pass votes. I mean, despite all of the anger about the 2-child cap, about the WASPy women, inheritance tax, whatever it may be, the party is generally still supporting them in these votes through Westminster. And Brian Leishman too is another one. He keeps making headlines for being very outspoken about Keir Starmer's government, but he keeps voting with the government. So unless that changes, I don't see the party really changing radically from what it is currently.
I think the pressures of government, though, are significant. Again, harking back to Rory the Tory's book, I mean, he was he turned up for all the 3-line whips, even when it was against his constituents' interests. But he eventually felt so bad about the whole thing that he just couldn't thole it anymore. Now, that tends to be a particular issue for the more cerebral MPs, and probably there's precious few of them. But nonetheless, it is a factor that intelligent people thinking about the contradictions and the sometimes unethical choices they've had to make in order to keep the government afloat eventually become exasperated. And I think perhaps too, as Starmer drifts further to the right, inevitably, as he must do, in order to deal with a very volatile situation in the South. I think we're about to see perhaps a readjustment of politics in the UK, maybe.
Oh, certainly.
Where there's a fight for right-wing votes.
Yeah.
And hang everyone else. Who cares? Because the view is increasingly is that's what will win the next election. I'm just not sure that the part of the Labour Party that produced, well, let's be candid, Jeremy Corbyn acquired more votes when he stood for Prime Minister than Starmer did.
Yeah.
So now Starmer won because the Tories didn't turn out. but the Tories will come back and reform will come back. So there'll be this fight between reform and Tories, and the Labour Party might be a beneficiary, who knows? But I suspect the internal stresses will become significant. And a party
Certainly.
that's always prey to factions anyway.
Yeah.
That could be interesting.
I'm reminded while you were speaking of the famous Ed Miliband era merchandise that Labour produced, which was a mug that said "Controls on Immigration," which makes me think that Labour are quite willing to play into right-wing politics when they need to in order to try and secure power. Which is a very depressing situation to be in. But no, I couldn't agree more about the realignment of politics. It certainly feels like that's happening as we speak. What's going on in the UK politics and in Westminster every day, it feels like this big kind of shifting time. But just on the Scottish Labour Party, I think a Scottish Labour Party that was truly independent from Westminster and was either in favour of an independence referendum or not actively hostile to it could be a very positive thing for the independence movement, given that we know that about a third of Scottish Labour voters do support independence. We could do a lot of good in trying to unite people without those kind of partisan lines in the sand.
Yeah, and of course the other factor too is the economic outlook, because here we have a situation where, dare I say it, the new US president takes a particular view on tariffs. He has a particular view of the world, which is all about making America great again. And we have the EU, which is a formidable presence economically. And we've got this little island sort of isolated after Brexit. And it's difficult to see how it can sustain itself given a very good following wind. But how it can survive, I'm sure economists will be questioning this right now, on its own, because there will be these power blocks. There will be China, United States, the BRICS that I talked about, including India, being a major economic force in the future. And that's where a lot of the economic growth will come. It's hard to see how you can get that growth in the UK.
Yeah. It's not possible, is it? Like, it's just not going to happen. And we're seeing that the growth is just not coming at Westminster level. And I think the whole Trump situation is a really strong case for Scotland to maintain its links with the EU and try and develop closer ties with Europe, to be honest, because that certainly feels like the only sustainable kind of future that we have in terms of our position on the global stage.
Yeah, I think increasingly the UK will go down the route of asset stripping. In other words, can we sell this to this company? Can we sell that to a different company and just eke out a few pennies to see us through to tomorrow? Because that's what happens if you victimize yourself by Brexit, etc., etc. But the trouble is, there's no evidence that Westminster understands even the semblance of what we've just been saying.
Oh, no, they don't care at all. Yeah.
I mean, but it's hard to say it's sustainable, though. I mean, for example, if I asked you to forecast what the UK is going to look like in 5 years' time, how would you describe it?
I'd say that Nigel Farage would be in a serious leadership position, whether that's prime ministerial or deputy prime ministerial. I think a merger between the Conservatives and Reform looks extraordinarily likely as we move forward, because the Conservatives are realizing that they're being squeezed out of power. I think we're looking at a similar situation to in the US, where we're handing large amounts of power to kind of businessmen and seeing more and more of the very wealthiest in the UK become kind of oligarchs. And I think we're looking at a more hostile country with more aggressive foreign policy. It's very scary to imagine being in a UK that looks like that. I also think that we see poverty at worse, in a much worse situation. There's no way that what the Labour government is doing right now is really going to take any real significant impact on people's everyday lives. I think we're looking at food banks like increasing even more than they already have. That's not a UK that I would want to live in. And I would hope that a lot of my fellow Scots would also not want to be part of that either.
What do you think? What do you think people thought when they saw the king turning up in a helicopter to visit a food bank?
Oh, they were horrified. I was horrified. I think just because the status quo says that the king or the queen or whoever in the monarchy goes along to make these visits at charities and doesn't necessarily give them anything. As far as I'm aware, no one has told me to the contrary. The king did not donate anything to the charity. You know, his time is considered the donation. Excuse me. Just because that is the status quo doesn't mean that's what we have to accept.
Exactly.
It's a horrible depiction of class problems in this country, about the way that we're supposed to view those in power. It's anarchic. It's not got a place in modern Britain at all, and certainly not in modern Scotland, when we know that a huge number of people and increasing numbers of people support the idea of a republic with a fairly elected democratic head of state. I mean, for me personally, I would like to see that. I just don't see any reason that we should be supporting the extreme and unsustainable lifestyles of some very, very wealthy people who live in palaces or in the UK. I think there is much better use of that money.
Do you think? I mean, it's a very good point. I mean, a lot of people I speak to say I would very much like to see a republic, but I don't see the SNP espousing any of that. I mean, what I see is the very opposite. It's the SNP government, the Scottish government, pandering to the present arrangements.
No, I just find that interesting. The other day, I was looking through pictures on like a news agencies will send you pictures of live pictures that are taken throughout the day. And I was just happened to be looking for something else, and I saw some pictures of John Swinney sitting down with the king, and I was like, oh, they didn't tell anybody that John Swinney was meeting the king today. They kept that quite quiet. I would imagine that if they thought that it would get a bit more support, they might have put out some kind of press release or statement, but they just sort of quietly let the pictures get put out by the news agencies. No, I don't think that the SNP are changing position on that in the immediate future. But I think that this is just something that changes with time, and it's a generational thing as well. Certainly people of my generation do not see the need for a monarchy. And as more and more people of my generation get into politics and have more say kind of culturally, then I would imagine that there would be more of a push towards republicanism, and that would maybe move the SNP as well. I mean, Believe in Scotland did a very interesting poll just before Christmas. I think they said it was, I can't remember the number specifically, but I think was it 58% for yes, if that also meant a republic. Those kind of numbers will certainly influence the decision makers in parties like the SNP to make them think about their policies. And I think eventually there will be a big push at an SNP conference to get the party to change position on this, just to reflect the modern kind of state of affairs. But I understand the argument that maybe for some people, the royals are completely separate and we should have a referendum after independence and decide on them. I think that's a totally reasonable position to have as well. But I think that the point is that people should at least be given an opportunity to have a say on what they think about the royals, which is not something that we are being afforded if we're part of the UK.
Well, that's certainly true. And I mean, I can't envisage a situation where any of the Westminster parties would espouse a republic. I mean, I speak to people privately and they say yes, but publicly they say, oh, no, definitely not. You know, why would we throw away hundreds of years of tradition, etc., etc.? But the reality is hundreds of years of tradition can sink you if it's the wrong tradition. And a lot of people would argue, well, you know, if you're going to tie your future to some set of values, these are not the values to do it to. I mean, you should choose other values. But public service, for example, that are not associated with birth. I mean, people from outside looking at the UK find that it's just the oddest thing. You know,
oh yeah, it's bizarre.
You have a head of state chosen
It's crazy.
which bed you were born in. I mean, what happened to democracy?
No, exactly. And as I say, the way that people in the UK are kind of expected to be subservient to that kind of system is so strange to me. And I think particularly, I know I do keep referring to people of my generation, but obviously I am of the younger generation, and the way that people have conversations of my age about the royals is certainly not with the kind of, I don't know, deference that would be expected of the British citizens.
Yeah, I mean, it's very odd. I mean, I have lots of American friends, and they see it as great fun, but shouldn't be part of politics. See,
Yeah.
it's like a circus. I mean, who doesn't like circuses? But what you can't have is the clowns voting for it.
No, they can just be a bit of pageantry. I mean, it's really interesting because when I first started at the National, people kind of were more of the opinion that let's not really talk about the royals. It's a bit uncomfortable. Like it might put some people off. Maybe people in the northeast and around Balmoral, you know, they might not want to lose the royals because it means a lot to them because it's where they've grown up and they've seen the king and the queen out in the community and whatnot. That was quite common. I would say that opinion is I hear it a lot less now from our readers and from our subscribers. I see a lot more people, more of the opinion that actually a pro-republic position would be beneficial to independence, to making the point that Scotland wants to do something different and be separate and distinct from the UK, and not just kind of be a smaller version of the UK, which is something that some people do worry about, definitely.
Yeah, I think they do. Talking about British institutions, I suspect a lot of your readers are not terribly happy with BBC Scotland. Do you find that a lot when you get comments about?
Yeah, definitely. I thought I was going to say, what have they done now? Because I don't know. There's always something going on. Yeah, I think the BBC in general is something that the readers are concerned by, and I think that there's a whole bunch of different reasons to have that kind of concern. I mean, the sort of worries about the people who are on the BBC editorial board having their head of news be previously from GB News is obviously very concerning about the direction of the BBC. A feeling of forced balance, which doesn't necessarily need to be there on a whole range of issues. I think most recently, particularly on Gaza, people feeling that there has been like a false kind of balance put upon the reporting, which is, in my view, inappropriate given the number of people who have been killed by the Israeli forces. So there's a whole bunch of things that people are unhappy with the BBC about, and BBC Scotland particularly. Yeah, there's a feeling that it's quite parochial, that it sort of has its own kind of news agenda often, and it seems. I what's the best way to describe this? So when I was a reporter, I did some studies into how the BBC News at 6 would report on stories about the UK government, and then how the Reporting Scotland show would report on stories revolving around the Scottish government. And I would look at which ones were positive, which ones were negative, and which ones were neutral. And what I would find was there was an awful lot of neutral or positive towards the UK government on the BBC News at 6, and there was an awful lot of negative towards the Scottish government on the Reporting Scotland show. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with scrutinising governments, holding them to account. This is good. This is what the freedom of the press is for. But if you are not doing it fairly across the board, that's when people are going to start to get frustrated and start to get upset. And so in that research, it definitely demonstrated what I think people feel, which is that the BBC tends to give a harder time to the Scottish government for domestic policy issues, concerns, than the BBC gives to the UK government for its own domestic policy failings. So that's what I find people get the most upset about, is that feeling that it's not fair.
Isn't the crux of it all the lack of accountability? I mean, take you, for example. You're accountable to your readers. You're intensely interested in your readers' opinions. It's what makes you a great journalist, a great editor. It's because of that empathy, that the sensitivity to what they're thinking and what they're doing and what's important to them. We have a situation in Scotland where we have a broadcaster who is completely unaccountable, it seems to me, in large part. if I can mix these words again, to its audience. In other words, even if it was completely opposed to everything that happened in Scotland, it could still continue to broadcast.
I think people get frustrated by how hard it can be to get a correction out of BBC Scotland. I know that I've had that issue myself when I've pointed out things in the past were incorrect. BBC Scotland and BBC at the UK level as well. You'll often find that something will be reported on incorrectly, and maybe that's been seen by millions of people, and then the correction just goes on a website that nobody looks at 3 weeks later, and it's about this big, and it's like, oh, well, how's that going to make sure that people have the correct information? And also the speed of these corrections. Sometimes it does take weeks, months, in order for anything to happen. And just because something gets a lot of complaints about it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be any kind of consequence either. It's quite rare that the BBC upholds the complaint, and when they do, maybe it's about like an editorial error, an inaccuracy or something, they generally don't sort of punish the journalist responsible, or if they do, it is not made public, which again is an issue with the transparency. We don't necessarily know what kind of action is being taken behind the scenes to ensure that that kind of mistake isn't taken again. So that's my concern about the accountability. From a journalistic perspective, is it's hard to find out how things get resolved, and it's just, if there's a urgency to kind of correct the record and correct mistakes that I don't think is felt by BBC.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the whole point, isn't it? I mean, you're accountable. You do a great job, but you're accountable.
Yes.
The BBC does a poor job because it's not accountable. I think that's the crux of it. I mean, if the BBC was accountable in the way that you're accountable, these mistakes wouldn't happen, because you as editor would say to your staff, we're not going to do that. We don't make these mistakes. And if we do, we go right back and say, mea culpa, this is how we will treat this in the future. It's because of that lack of connection and that need to have a connection, which all good journalists have. That's the essence of it, it seems to me, is that if you don't feel the accountability, you don't understand the need. And so therefore I I understand why Jack Straw insisted on taking broadcasting out of the devolution settlement. Because and the result of it is we've ended up where we've ended up, which is a bunch of people ostensibly making news who are not accountable to the people they're serving.
No, it's interesting. It is. I mean, I go back to your point about mistakes and accountability. Is that I've made mistakes. Do you know what I mean? I've made mistakes. I've made errors in reporting, and I've had to apologize for them. And I've ended up waking up on a Saturday morning with 200 emails from subscribers being like, you were damaging the independence movement with this error. And I'm like, oh God, that was not what I intended to do. But the point is, when I've done that, I have always tried to respond to all of the people who've got in touch. I've tried to speak publicly about the mistake that has been made. And I have really quite genuinely wanted to resolve the problem. And I don't necessarily think that is an attitude that is held by that many editors and producers in the UK media more broadly, and not just in the BBC, but in other newspapers. I remember there was one particular, error of judgment, put an apology out, which it took a lot to do, but the amount of people who were saying, oh, well, we're so grateful that she apologized. I mean, it's nice that people said that, but I also thought it really shouldn't be that special a moment to have a senior journalistic figure put out an apology. It should not be even notable that that's something that I've done. And I thought the fact that it was so unusual said quite a lot about the state of the media in this country, to be honest.
I think that's a very perceptive comment, because I think it speaks to how a lot of people feel about the media. What you did was commendable, not only from an ethical point of view, but it was also commendable and reflects so well on you as a person, as well as a professional, because you felt that was important. I think if you work in an environment where that is not seen to be important, it's corrosive. It's corrosive because you become less of a journalist. The very thing that you set out to achieve, is actually eroded because the standards are not maintained. And I mean, I used to work with major corporations on ethical issues, and that's one of the things I noted most keenly was so many senior executives felt that the environment was so corrosive in terms of short-term results that they made many immoral judgments. That's not the case in BBC Scotland, of course, because they're under no pressure whatsoever, except to do whatever somebody in London has said. But that it does erode you as a person. It eventually becomes disabling because you accept low standards as the norm. So what you've striven to do is raise standards and keep them there. There are people, I suspect, who are working at a very low level and are plumbing it even deeper. And that's not good as a person. I mean, I spoke to so many executives who said to me after the event, they said, in fact, it's confirmed by research in the United States, when retired executives were asked, what is the thing you regret most in your business life? Many of these spent 40, 50 years in business. They said, I wish I'd behaved better.
Wow.
These are old men in the main, of course, back then. I wish I'd behaved better because I had the opportunity to behave better. I didn't take it.
That's really telling.
Isn't it? So lots of sad old men wandering about the United States saying, I wish I'd behaved better when I had the chance. And it's so sad, you know, and that's because the culture is corrosive.
Yeah, absolutely.
And eventually that corruption and that corrosion infects the individual. And they become less of a person, not just less of a journalist, but less of a person. And that's deeply saddening. It really is. But I detect that in BBC Scotland the whole time. I listen to people, I watch people, and I think, this is not you. And you should stop it. But anyway, we are where we are with that. So if you were to look, this is an inevitable question. I forgive me for asking this question, but I need to ask it. If you were to look at you in 5 years' time, what would you expect or hope to be doing?
This is something that I actually really struggle to answer. And I think the reason for that is because I wasn't expecting to be at this position in my career by this time anyway. So when I was younger and when I was a reporter and working in production in newspapers, I had always thought it would be great to be an editor, but I didn't expect it to happen so soon within my career. So it's already a bit of a strange situation for me to be in, because within the National, I'm as high as I could go, right? I love what I do at the National. I find it an absolute honor and an absolute privilege to lead the team on this paper. My colleagues are absolutely incredible. I couldn't ask for a better working environment when it comes to getting to report on the things that I really deeply cared about, and the things that when I was a student and studying journalism, I thought, gosh, like I really wish that there was more coverage of these things in the media. I get to do that. I get to actually make sure that those things do get covered properly in the media. And I'm with a bunch of journalists who feel the same way. And I'm so grateful for that every day. It's honestly, I love it so much. So beyond the National, I truly don't know, John, is the honest answer to the question, because I'm not thinking beyond the National at the moment. It's my pride and joy. I love doing it every day. I love the Sunday National. I love the deadlines, which is crazy because I hate them at the same time. But yeah, it's all great. It's all really good. It's very stressful, but overall, I love it. Yeah.
Well, you know, for someone who's working in a very stressful environment, I suspect part of the enjoyment you get from the job is that stress. You know,
Yeah, it feels you.
Yeah, it fulfills you, and you want to do better each time, and that's hugely commendable. I mean, and there are very few jobs that enable people to do that. That's the other important thing.
Completely. I just want the National to grow and grow from what it is right now. And I would love for people across the rest of the UK who have an interest in kind of left-leaning progressive politics to take an interest in reading the National as well. Like, there's been a lot more of that going on over the past couple of years, which is fantastic, because they feel that they're not having that news served to them in England or Wales or Northern Ireland, wherever it may be. I'm so happy that they feel that they can have a sort of media home at the National as well. And I would love to continue that growth. I would love to develop our arts and culture section. I think that's one thing that we're maybe missing a bit of. We're a small team, we can only do so much, but I would absolutely love if we could have a dedicated arts and culture reporter at some stage down the line and really champion Scotland's art and culture sector, because that's a huge part of who we are as a nation and as our identity. So politics is only one part of what we do. So that's one thing that I would love to expand upon. So I'll say that in 5 years, we'll have the best arts and culture coverage in Scotland.
Well, you could well have a whole section. American newspapers have a whole section just, and you know, I mean,
the dream.
You need muscles to carry a Sunday newspaper in the US.
We'll aim towards that then. We'll aim towards that.
I have to say, Laura, you are by far and away, with apologies to so many others who've been on the show, 188 shows. You've been a fantastic interviewee, which is not always straightforward when you're editor, I have to say. You have to sort of change gears a little bit there. But thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and a privilege to talk to you. And I hope perhaps maybe a year from now we can talk again and see how things have moved on for you and for the National.
I'd love that. We'll see if all my hair's gone grey from the stress yet.
You're looking great on it, I have to say. Thank you very much indeed. And if you can stay online for a little bit longer after we're through that, I'd appreciate that. Well, there you are, folks. We promise you a great interview, and you've had a great interview. We always like to inform, educate, and entertain. And I think you would agree with me, and certainly based on the comments we've had tonight, we've met all these objectives. Thank you to Laura. Thank you to you for watching. Look after each other. Stay safe. Good night.